Kicking off. So this is Sofia, all the way out from Dunedin today.
Woohoo!
So made it here quite early. So you must have left really early today.
I decided to last minute fly.
Oh.
I got lazy. I was going to drive up, and then I was like, "Oh, that sounds hard."
We're going to move up throughout the session because we're going to drive, so I didn't want to make sure that you're going to be too late driving up. So talk about Azure B2C app registrations. Just ask questions.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Thanks. All right, so it's me, Sofia. I work at Azure, which is my company. We have pretty much only girls that work at Azure at the moment. Just mums who work around our kids, which is one of the things I really wanted to do. So yeah, we try to be flexible, and like probably one of the only companies that have that, only ladies in IT. So I started it in April, and we do automation and B2C, really. It's become a thing. So what is it? It is essentially what you use when you get to my IR, inland revenue, or you want to get your vaccine pass. You logged in and use B2C. So B2C in itself is really your authentication, and it allows you to use others' authentication providers. So instead of you having to manage usernames and passwords and all that pesky privacy stuff, you can outsource it, which allows you to do more with less. It also allows you to protect your environment. So we heard before about Azure AD and all that stuff. Well, once you invite even a contractor into your Azure AD, you actually have quite a bit of access. You get the right to read AD and a lot of the attributes that are in AD. So you want to think about who you invite and when you invite them. You can do set up an Azure B2C tenant. I'm going to take you down like some quick steps on how to do that. But essentially it means that you give them access to only those pieces that they need. So Azure B2C is very much like a separate AD tenant that lives outside your business, but still under the same subscription in Azure. So it gives you that lovely, yes, you can have some stuff, but no, you can't have other things. Like you can't look up your public Teams channels in there. You might have stuff in there that you don't want to share with external parties. The only way to really truly be sure and protect yourself is to set up B2C. You want to do a joint venture with another company, you can set up a B2C tenant to hold those that are going to be working on that joint venture. You want customers to integrate to an app that you have, again, you can set up a B2C tenant. You can migrate existing customers. So say that you currently have an app that you have access to external people, and you've set it up so they have username, they have login, all of that fun stuff. You're managing it. Then you kind of go, this maybe wasn't the best idea. It's actually quite easy to migrate it because you can use Graph API, which is a programmatic interface into B2C, and make a soft migration. So your end users go to login and they just click an extra OK, basically, and they've moved over. So your end users get very little notice that anything's even happened, but you've increased your security tenfold. You also have the ability to use other identity providers. So for example, you want to allow Facebook, you want to allow Google, you can allow really anything that has an OData. Cool. So one of the things that's kind of important to understand when you're talking B2C is what is authentication versus what is authorization. So this is something that's actually quite confusing for a lot of people, so which is why I put it up there. So if you feel like I'm telling you how to suck eggs, I'm sorry. But just want to get this down pat so we know. So authentication is making sure a user is in fact who they say they are. Whereas authorization is what can you access? So they're two quite separate things. but we need both. Yeah, that's my first kind of what is it. So to create your B2C tenant, you need quite a lot of resources. Or not resources, quite a lot of rights in your subscription. So there is a way currently in Power Pages that you can create a B2C tenant straight from Power Pages. Sounds like a great idea. Why don't we just do that? First off, your user journeys will be the legacy user journeys. It will not be current ones that you should be using. Even though it's in preview, Microsoft in their almighty wisdom decided to implement the legacy ones and the actual ones. You also might not be the person that has the privileges, because dealing with 365, you're probably not also the Azure admin. So this means that you're probably two different people doing these jobs. So when you go to create it through the Azure portal, one key thing to bear in mind, just put a screenshot on it. If you search B2C, the first option is not the option you should pick. Because in Azure, when you create things, you can buy service offerings from other people. That's kind of one of the features of buying things there. And the first one's not actually Microsoft, that's somebody else managing your B2C. So don't pick that one. Right. Now, when you create a tenant, we have something quite different. So normally when you create a tenant aspect in Azure, your option is where is your data center. So we always pick Australia, right? Because for all intents and purposes, apparently we're Australia. But yeah, it's coming. But in B2C, it's one of the few places where you actually pick your country. You don't pick where the data center is. It will pick your data center for you. So on the drop down, you pick New Zealand, it goes, yeah, you're going to Australia, but you actually pick the country. And then you simply follow what you want to have it called. What this does, it creates a secondary tenant. So when you go to manage it, screenshot it, but in Azure, on your login screen, you can switch directories. This becomes another directory. So you don't manage it from the normal part of your Azure portal where your normal AD sits.
They come with access.
No, up to 50,000 users a month is free. So there is really no reason. And that's 50,000 users, so actively using it. It's not 50,000 you have there. So you need to have quite a lot of activity to start paying for it. It is by far the cheapest option in the market if you look around. There are other options like so good with pronunciations, but they're a lot more expensive. Yeah. One of the cool things is you can make it look like yours. So when you normally log into anything Azure based, you get this like very Microsoft-y looking login page. That's rather bland looking. Most people don't want it to look like you're logging into Microsoft when you log into your own app. So you get the option to create branding materials. So all you need to do is actually supply your company branding. There is some trickiness to this. So fairly simple just to select configure, but then what you've got is this lovely thing. So background image, less than 300 KB, you could probably squeeze something in, but the image size for your logo needs to be less than 10 KBs. To put it in perspective, that thing that has 2 bursts on it, if I added 3 bursts, it was too big. So think small, predominantly because it wants to load really fast. So one of the things that is quite important, you also have the option to set a background image, a background color. So you want to set your background color to something really close to your background image, because then it doesn't look like white and then your image loads. So it gives it a little bit more of a seamless transition when you then. The other thing is you have to actually turn it on. So even if you've put your branding on there, you have to select that you want to use the branding. It doesn't automatically go, oh yeah, you put branding on. Sweet, got this. No, it doesn't. You have to go into the page layout once you've configured flows. So what are flows and why do I configure those then? Flows are what happens when a user goes to your site. So you have a standard, it's called a Susie, sign up, sign in. That's a Susie flow. I like this. So what comes out of the box are things like sign up, sign in, password reset, all of those lovely things. And then you've got some legacy flows, which are also, I believe, password reset and sign up, sign in. Those are kind of out of the box individual like flows that you just kind of go, yep, cool, I'll have that. And you enable them. Once you've enabled them, you pick what you allow. So out of the box, the only thing you have allowed is email. That means you're still managing their local accounts. So what you want to do is actually sign up for the other identity providers. And that depends on what identity provider you're going to go with. Microsoft's really simple because you go, oh, we're Microsoft. So it's basically 2 click boxes. Facebook and Google and those others are a few more click boxes, but not a huge amount of configuration. Then what you can do is set up different flows depending on what they're coming from. So you can say that if you log in with a Google account, I want you to do this. If you log in with a Microsoft account, do this. So this is all kind of fairly simple things to configure. Right. So once you've configured the basis of your B2C, you can go into Power Pages and actually connect it to something. So there's a couple of to and fro's here that we're going to go through. But one thing that you're going to need is this lovely reply URL. The reply URL is what you're going to use no matter what you sign up with. So if you're using Pages or anything else you want to integrate with, you're going to need the reply URL. Because that is where Azure B2C sends they're good. This is the person. These are the details that I can send you. That generally comes through as a JWT token, which is a standard. It's really simple to use, I guess. So what we then have to do is go back into Azure again, because now we need to register the app. So anything that B2C uses, it needs to know where it's sending the information. Not in this case, I called it Russia's demo. And we're using user flows. And the redirect URI is a web one because we're using a web app, basically. There are 3 different options in there, but the most commonly one is web or a single page app. So, so once you've got that redirect URL, you're kind of like, cool, we're happy. We need to enable access tokens because the way that the Power Pages routes and interprets this is this little tick box down here. And we don't get that available when we set it up. Not sure why, but basically, once you've clicked, I've done it, it brings you into this page and we just click authentication. You can also double check that we have the correct redirect URI, and we can also change it. So if you Oh, just spelling error, because that happens. Do that there. Right. Here comes those brilliant user flows. So we've got a password reset and a sign up, sign in, Susie, short. Now this is where we've got, this is kind of the page, I guess, B2C, we'll call it that. So we've got your app registrations, not legacy ones. We've got user flows, don't use the legacy ones, because who knows when Microsoft decides we're not going to have those anymore. And company branding. We can, this is also where we can set up those identity providers. So an identity provider are those Google, Facebook, all those lovely things that we can leverage. Right. Other thing we need for our page is an issuer. So it's only going to trust the authentication that was sent through from the issuer we've said is okay. Because there's a lot of trust going on here between the two. We need to make sure that they're friendly. And the simplest way to get this is actually going through to the JSON. So what we do is we run the user flow. So at the top, you always have the option of running a user flow. Running a user flow gives you the option of seeing what is going to happen and seeing the end product of the user flow. It's particularly helpful if you're sending through claims, which are additional attributes you've collected from the person who set up, or from a process you've run as part of that user flow. Say that you're collecting information from another app about what membership they have of something. You could send that through as a claim, and you can then review that when you run the user flow. So what we have to do to get this issuer is, instead of actually clicking, there's a run button down here, but there wasn't enough space. Instead of clicking run, you click the URL hyperlink, and it gives you issuer at the very top. This is the issuer that we trust. So now we've got all the things, we have to pull it together. This is where we put all that cool stuff that we gathered before. So this is where the issuer goes, authority. So as usual, we like to name things different depending on where we are. When we register to the app registration, we have something called an application ID, and bracket client to the client ID. And that redirect URL that we had before. So these are the things that kind of go, here's B2C, here's your app page, be friendly, go forth. So now we're going to log in. Ta-da! Isn't it beautiful? I will not win any design awards on this guy. It was a 5-minute job in GIMP, but they're small enough to show up. So this way, we haven't enabled any identity providers here. So this is a local account. If you have enabled identity providers, we will have other boxes. And the first time you sign in, one of it. It's also set up with kind of a pseudo two-factor. So what it does is you have to put in your email address, and they will email you a code. It's to make sure that what you're signing up with is, in fact, an email address that exists, so you can't keep spamming it, which is quite helpful, I think. I like those two different thoughts. You can also force two-factor. But one thing to bear in mind is you cannot force continuous login. So for example, there's a request that comes up quite frequently is, I develop app B. I would like my users to stay logged in for 6 months. Why? But client wants to do this. If you use B2C, you can't do that because you don't own it. You're merely using somebody else's. So their policy will override your policy because your policy doesn't actually matter. You've outsourced that. Somebody else has taken responsibility for that authentication, therefore their rules are their rules. So if they want you to log in every single time, you will log in every single time. If they mandate you have to two-factor, you can't not mandate two-factor. They will be having two-factor.
They being the people that created the B2C.
Nope, they being the people who own that login. So if you use Google, if you have enforced on your Google login, I want two-factor every time. If you use Google in your app, it will be, if I set up an app, you will be two-factoring every time. It's, anyway, it gives you a lot more, as a person, a lot more ownership over your own, which I think is quite helpful.
Does that mean you can't force two-factor for a person who's using an account that doesn't currently have two-factor enabled?
You can tick two-factor and make it two-factor, but if they've, it is possible that they can override it, but I don't believe so. Because it does become an extra one. So when you've signed into another one, you kind of get your own extra two-factor with Microsoft. So you actually get a secondary one. So you know how on the authenticator you have, you know, company B. You now end up with a like company B in brackets, the other one. So you actually end up with multiples and two-factor. So someone like me who ends up with lots of things in authenticator, it becomes a little bit crowded, but yeah, we'll create another one.
What was if I haven't?
Yeah. So should work in most cases, but there's always that one edge case. But generally speaking, if you really want two-factor to be enforced, you pick those identity providers where you can force two-factor. So it's because obviously you can't make someone use two-factor on an authentication that doesn't have that ability.
Excuse me.
Yes.
So by default, this is in Microsoft.
Not by default, no. So this is just a local login, which kind of becomes a Microsoft login because it's still an 80. But no, so there are two different options in terms of Microsoft accounts. So you can have a Microsoft account or a personal Microsoft account. They're two different identity providers in B2C. So you can say, I will only allow corporate Microsoft accounts, or I will allow personal Microsoft accounts. Very similar to how when you log in for an Ignite or something, where you can pick what your type of account is, because they're two different identity providers.
Will it work or school account?
Yeah, that one, work or school, but you know, it's not necessarily school, is it? We could just be mine. Don't we all have multiple accounts? Isn't that how we roll?
We want the same password though.
Admin. Admin. That's just, it should be illegal. Right, so that's what you could, like, anything that has OAuth or SAML can be registered. It isn't limited, but there are kind of the ones that come standard, and they do occasionally change, that you can very simply set up through some guided GUI if you want to through Azure, or you can they obviously require more work if they're not available just out of the box. One thing that's really cool, but you need to be a little bit, I wouldn't say wary, more cautious about, are the custom policies. So this is where you're going to change it to do what you want it to do. So I want to not just gather extra information. Gathering extra information is simple to do in the front end, but I want to run a process. I want someone to do this and that to happen upon a login or registration or anything like that. There are custom policies for that. Microsoft have them available on GitHub, but when there are new security things that come out and updates, because you're now managing your code yourself in XML, you don't automatically get the patched updates like you do from the out of the box user ones. So it's really important that if you use custom policies, subscribe to the GitHub repo, because Microsoft do push them to the GitHub repo, but unless you subscribe to them, pretty sure none of us go into GitHub just to check if there's updates. That's just wrong. Who has that time? So subscribe to the GitHub repo if you're going to use them. You can do things like link it up with logic apps and function apps to automate checking what groups they're members of, granting access based on what other memberships, or if they've got a setting in an app that says you can do this, then pass it through and update. Really, it's kind of how sensible are your requirements most of the time. Just because you can doesn't necessarily mean you should. Try and store as little as possible in B2C would be my tip, because really it's still something you have to take care of. GDPR still is a thing. Don't store anything you shouldn't store. Don't collect information on people you don't need. If you collect address, why are you sending them something? All of that fun stuff. And they still have the option of saying no. Really important. It does mean that you don't have to manage things like people leaving a company. So, for example, you invite contractors in, you have B2C. If that person has left that company, you don't have to be notified of everything, because their company would have retired them in their system. They no longer have access, so they can't sign into yours. Well, they shouldn't be able to. That company should be retiring them. Whew. I mean, that's a hard lot of kettle of fish. But those are kind of the simple things, is making sure that you can safely operate without having people be able to look up things. And it does mean that AD, Teams, all of the fun things that are actually quite open internally are not open to people that they shouldn't be open to. Yeah, that's me.
That's a question.
Sure.
What's the default subdomain name? You know, when you create tenant, it'll be your company.microsoft on Microsoft.
Mm-hmm. You pick it.
Okay.
Correct. So you do have to check when you set it up. It does that validation thing. Is this domain available? And
you could have your company. Yes.
Yeah, and really you can set up as many as you want. Like, you can go nuts. I think I got 4 for various things, because I'm keeping it separate. But it means that, you know, I've got a dev one so I can test it. Fine, that's another thing. If you're going to do it, please set up 2, at least 2, please, because you should have 1 for dev, 1 for prod, because when you need to make a change, you don't want to make the change in live. Bad.
On a Friday.
On a Friday. Woohoo!
Friday after that.
It's like, oh. But because it's all XML basically in the back end, it's really easy to integrate with DevOps. So you can pipeline it, just automate the deployment. But don't automate it until you've tested it, and have some robust testing in terms of that sign up, because it is embarrassing if you end up with an outage for your customers. So don't roll things up.
Say, for example, Matt invited to a meeting, can I still be granted admin team?
Yeah, so you can still be granted those things. That's not a problem. It's just how they're granted. You do need to map it through, but
and then say hypothetically, once I add team dev, and I can access all the.
it's separated a little bit, so you don't quite have the same, like, Because the idea isn't that you are the master of all that you survey. The idea is you're a master of only that which we want you to be a master of. It's a little bit like B2B, but not, would be the best way to describe it. So you end up mapping a login from B2C to your normal, ends up doing that, kind of becomes a little ghost record. And then that ghost record is what gets the access.
To set one up, you need to be a global admin to be able to create one.
No, so I have a page on that. Then you need to be like registering it, but otherwise you're just contributor. Don't have to be global, just contributor, and that's because you're signing up for more costs essentially, and you're signing up a new tenant. I mean, it can end up costing you money if you, for example, Genesis Energy uses B2C. They have, last I checked, 650,000 customers. They pay for it. IOD will be paying for it because they definitely have more than 50,000 people. So it is a cost, but the way that you would really do it is ideally you assign someone with 10 privileges, temporary contributor, do the job, and then you're out. I mean, that is a perfect example where you could use PIM on your existing AD. Privileged identity management.
When you log as a consultant, I guess, would basically log into someone's tenant, but you're from outside their world, so they don't necessarily want you to have hassle, so you have to basically go in and grant yourself time access, browse, you have to be able to do something you're going to do, jump in, and then jump back out again, right?
I believe PwC and Deloitte are now recommending that for normal people within their tenancies as well now. Yeah.
It's a pain, but
it is a pain, but it's logged. And then it also protects you from anything. I love it because if I don't have access to it, I couldn't have done anything bad. I mean, really, it stops any scapegoating on people if you don't have the access to do anything silly. It works for everyone.
So we've got a few minutes, but the process of the app registration is also, if anyone's built a custom connector to do Power Automate or Power Apps,
it's the same.
So you got to register an app, you got to find your endpoints and re-authentication and everything, which is all exactly the same, right? So
yeah, it's exactly the same for everything, which is really handy. Once you got the app registrations down, you just zoom right through it.
with a custom connector, you can obviously get that pop-up screen for authentication. You don't see it, just happen. Just grab the data, add business central.
Brilliant. And it also means that you can leverage quite a few, because once you've set up, you can have one B2C do multiple apps. You can set up multiple sign up, sign in. Susie's. Let's just call them Susie's. Everyone knows what the Susie is. You can have multiple Susies that go to different endpoints. You can have really check anything you want. I wouldn't go mixing and matching too much because, again, it doesn't cost anything to set up multiples, and it does give you some delineation about